Russia just submitted a bill that will change everything. Continuous military mobilization from January 1st to December 31st, 2026. No more seasonal drafts. No more breaks. Putin's military machine now needs bodies 365 days a year. But the numbers behind this desperate move reveal the biggest military lie of the 21st century. For 3 years, Moscow has called this a special military operation, a limited, controlled intervention that would last weeks, not years. They promised minimal casualties, swift victory, and the restoration of Russian military prestige. Instead, we're witnessing the complete collapse of everything Putin claimed about Russian military power. The State Duma's mobilization bill, submitted just yesterday, isn't a sign of strength. It's a confession of catastrophic failure. But this goes far beyond just another mobilization. We're talking about 1,045,220 Russian troops confirmed lost in Ukraine. We're seeing a $1.1 trillion rearmament program, the largest since the Soviet collapse. We're watching Putin transform Russia into a permanent war economy because the alternative is admitting the entire Russian military narrative was built on lies. The documents we've uncovered show exactly how deep this deception goes and why Putin's own generals know the truth he's been hiding from the world. On July 22nd, the State Duma submitted a bill that destroys forever Putin's special operation narrative. Russia now needs soldiers every single day of the year. The proposed legislation transforms Russia's current seasonal mobilization system into year-round conscription, running from January 1st to December 31st, 2026. Currently, Russia recruits citizens in 2 waves, spring and autumn, allowing the military to process recruits in manageable batches while maintaining the illusion of limited engagement. The new system completely eliminates these breaks, establishing that conscription of citizens for military service is carried out during the calendar year based on a decree of the President of the Russian Federation. Committee Chairman Andrei Kartopolov and his deputy Andrei Krasov submitted the bill, indicating direct support from the Defense Ministry. The legislation is expected to pass this fall and take effect on January 1st, 2026. But this isn't military modernization. It's a desperate response to catastrophic losses that Putin can no longer hide. The numbers tell the real story. 1,045,220 Russian soldiers lost in Ukraine as of July 23, 2025, according to Ukraine's general staff. The independent Russian media outlet Media Zona, in collaboration with the BBC's Russian service, confirmed the identities of 119,154 Russian military personnel killed in Ukraine. These aren't Ukrainian propaganda numbers. These are verified deaths with names, faces, and families. The continuous mobilization bill represents Putin's admission that his army cannot sustain current operations without a fundamental restructuring of Russian society around permanent war. Compare this to Putin's original promises in February 2022. The special military operation would last weeks, not years. Casualties would be minimal, objectives limited, and normal life would continue for most Russians. Putin specifically avoided calling it a war to maintain the fiction that this was controlled, professional military action. Now, 3 years later, Russia needs every eligible man in the country to keep fighting a war that should have ended before most people realized it had begun. But the mobilization crisis goes even deeper than official numbers suggest. Russian authorities have expanded FSB powers to prevent draft-age men from leaving the country, creating a virtual prison for millions of Russian men. 200,000 people have already reported for service under current mobilization, and authorities are planning another wave for fall 2025, targeting up to 500,000 additional soldiers. Border controls now specifically target military-age men, with the FSB having direct access to prevent conscripts from fleeing. Russia is becoming a militarized state where young men cannot escape service in Putin's failed war. This desperate scramble for bodies reveals the first crack in Putin's military facade. But the real shock comes when you see what this mobilization is actually costing the Russian state. As news of continuous mobilization spreads, panic grips Russian families across the country. The FSB now has unprecedented powers to trap potential conscripts inside Russia. Russian authorities have implemented the most comprehensive border control system since the Soviet era, specifically targeting military-age men attempting to leave the country. The Federal Security Service now has direct access to military registration databases, enabling real-time identification of men subject to conscription at all border crossings. New regulations require military-age men to present additional documentation, proving their exemption status or completed service before being allowed to travel abroad. The system creates a digital net that captures potential conscripts at airports, land borders, and even internal checkpoints. These measures represent the most significant restriction on Russian citizens' freedom of movement since the USSR's collapse. But these desperate measures reveal how badly Putin miscalculated Russian society's willingness to fight his war. Reports from across Russia describe families frantically seeking ways to protect their sons from conscription, with some attempting to flee to neighboring countries before the new system takes full effect. The Moscow Times reports that enhanced border controls are specifically designed to prevent the kind of mass exodus that occurred during the initial mobilization announcement in September 2022. Independent Russian media documents a surge in inquiries about military exemptions, medical deferrals, and alternative service options. The fact that Putin must physically trap Russians inside their own country to maintain his army demonstrates the complete collapse of voluntary support for the war. This contrasts sharply with Ukraine's mobilization efforts, where citizens volunteer for service and international support provides advanced training and equipment. While Russia resorts to coercion and border controls to fill its ranks, Ukraine receives volunteers from around the world and sophisticated military aid from NATO allies. Russian conscripts receive minimal training and obsolete equipment before being sent to the front lines. Ukrainian forces benefit from months of specialized training in NATO countries and access to cutting-edge Western military technology. The difference in motivation, preparation, and support explains much about the battlefield outcomes we're witnessing. But Putin's border control strategy is creating new problems he didn't anticipate. The restrictions are damaging Russia's already battered economy by preventing skilled workers from traveling for business, education, or family reasons. International companies are finding it increasingly difficult to maintain operations in Russia when their employees cannot travel freely. The brain drain that began with initial mobilization is now being artificially contained, creating internal pressure that could destabilize the regime. Reports suggest that even pro-government Russians are beginning to question a system that treats its own citizens as potential flight risks. Border controls reveal Putin's fear of his own people's judgment on this war. But the economic cost of maintaining this military machine tells an even more devastating story. Russia announces its largest military spending program since the Soviet collapse. $1.1 trillion allocated for rearmament through 2036. The rearmament program represents the most ambitious military modernization effort in Russian history, exceeding even Soviet-era defense spending as a percentage of GDP. Ukrainian intelligence reports indicate Russia plans to completely overhaul its military-industrial complex, replacing equipment lost in Ukraine while preparing for potential future conflicts with NATO. The program includes advanced missile systems, naval modernization, Air Force expansion, and development of new weapons technologies designed to counter Western military advantages. Defense analysts note that this level of spending would require Russia to maintain a war economy indefinitely, diverting resources from civilian infrastructure, education, and healthcare. The timeline extends to 2036, indicating Putin's regime is planning more than a decade of sustained military confrontation. But this massive spending commitment reveals the depth of Putin's strategic miscalculation and the regime's growing desperation. The Institute for the Study of War notes that such extensive rearmament plans indicate Russian preparation for potential future conflict with NATO, suggesting Putin sees the Ukraine war as just the beginning of a broader confrontation with the West. The spending levels required would consume an enormous portion of Russia's GDP, forcing the country into a permanent war economy that prioritizes military production over civilian needs. Economic analysts warn that sustaining this level of military spending under international sanctions could trigger economic collapse within the next decade. The rearmament program essentially admits that Russia's current military capabilities are inadequate for Putin's geopolitical ambitions. Compare Russia's desperate rearmament gamble with NATO's sustainable support strategy for Ukraine. While Russia mortgages its entire economic future on military spending, NATO countries provide aid from their existing defense budgets without compromising their civilian economies. The United States alone has provided over $100 billion in aid to Ukraine while maintaining robust economic growth and technological advancement. European allies have increased defense spending to NATO's 5% GDP target while simultaneously investing in renewable energy, infrastructure, and social programs. Russia's all-or-nothing approach to military spending reveals a regime that has abandoned any pretense of balanced governance in favor of pure militarism. But the rearmament program faces insurmountable obstacles that Putin's planners seem to ignore. International sanctions have cut Russia off from advanced semiconductors, precision machinery, and specialized materials needed for modern weapons production. The brain drain caused by war and political repression has depleted Russia's pool of qualified engineers and technicians needed for complex military projects. Western export controls specifically target dual-use technologies that Russia needs for military modernization, forcing the country to rely on inferior domestic alternatives or expensive black market acquisitions. The program's success depends on resources and capabilities that Russia no longer possesses, making it more of a propaganda exercise than a realistic military strategy. The rearmament program shows Putin doubling down on military solutions to political problems. But the human cost of this strategy reveals the true desperation behind these grand announcements. Russian authorities quietly plan another mass mobilization wave for fall 2025, up to 500,000 additional soldiers needed to sustain current operations. According to reports from PRM.UA, the Kremlin is preparing its largest mobilization effort since the war began, targeting 500,000 additional conscripts to replace losses and maintain offensive capabilities. The mobilization will likely coincide with implementation of the year-round conscription system, creating a continuous flow of new recruits to feed the conflict. Russian military planners recognize that current force levels are insufficient to achieve strategic objectives in Ukraine while maintaining defensive positions along other borders. The scale of this mobilization would bring Russia's total military commitment to levels not seen since World War II, requiring activation of reserve units and conscription of men previously considered exempt from service. Intelligence reports suggest Russian commanders specifically requested these additional forces to launch a major offensive before winter 2025. But this enormous mobilization requirement exposes the complete failure of Putin's original military strategy and the unsustainable nature of his current approach. The need for 500,000 additional soldiers represents an admission that Russia has already lost more troops than it can replace through normal recruitment, and that the war is far from the quick victory Putin promised. Military analysts note that mobilizing so many additional soldiers would require pulling personnel from other military districts, leaving Russia vulnerable on other fronts and potentially triggering unrest in regions that have already contributed heavily to the war effort. The mobilization would also require enormous resources to train, equip, and support these new forces, further straining Russia's already overburdened military infrastructure. Most critically, it demonstrates that Putin's regime has no exit strategy beyond throwing more bodies at an increasingly hopeless military situation. This desperate search for more soldiers contrasts sharply with Ukraine's increasingly sophisticated and well-equipped military forces. While Russia scrambles for 500,000 poorly trained conscripts, Ukraine benefits from NATO training programs that produce highly skilled, motivated fighters equipped with advanced Western weapons. Russian forces are becoming less effective over time as experienced units are destroyed and replaced by hastily trained recruits. Ukrainian forces are becoming more capable with time, while Russian forces are becoming less effective as the quality gap continues to widen. International support ensures Ukraine's military capabilities improve each month, while Russia's decline accelerates. But Putin's mobilization strategy now targets Ukraine's ability to recruit and train its own forces, revealing the regime's growing desperation and willingness to commit war crimes. According to MSN reports, Russian forces have begun systematically attacking Ukrainian military recruitment centers, attempting to disrupt Ukraine's mobilization efforts through terror tactics. These attacks on civilian infrastructure represent clear violations of international law and demonstrate Putin's recognition that he cannot win through conventional military means. The targeting of recruitment centers shows Russia views Ukraine's ability to maintain its army as an existential threat to Russian objectives. This strategy of attacking civilian targets to undermine military capabilities represents a fundamental shift toward total war tactics that further isolate Russia from the international community. The need for 500,000 more soldiers reveals Putin's recognition that his current strategy is failing catastrophically. But the true revelation comes when you examine what these numbers actually mean for Russian military power. A Mediazona BBC investigation confirms 119,154 Russian military deaths. The real losses are likely much higher, exposing the world's second army narrative. The joint investigation by Mediazona and the BBC's Russian service, based on open-source data, confirmed the identities of 119,154 Russian military personnel killed in Ukraine. This number, while shocking, represents only deaths that could be publicly verified and is therefore a conservative underestimate of total losses. Ukraine's General Staff, meanwhile, estimates Russian losses at 1,045,220 soldiers. While there's a discrepancy between the numbers, both point to a military catastrophe of historic proportions. The Mediazona BBC investigation provides a face and story to a growing number of the dead, undermining Kremlin propaganda. But these numbers, even the conservative ones, completely debunk Putin's narrative of a limited and successful special military operation. The losses are unsustainable for any modern army and reveal incompetence and disregard for human life that has shocked the world. The need for continuous mobilization and massive rearmament is not a sign of strength, but a tacit acknowledgement that the Russian army has been decimated in Ukraine. The lie of the world's second army has been exposed not by Western propaganda, but by verifiable data and the silent testimony of thousands of Russian families who have lost their loved ones. Compare Russia's reluctance to admit its losses with Ukraine's transparency, which, while not releasing exact numbers, openly acknowledges the human cost of war. This difference in approach reflects the difference between an open and closed society, between a defensive war and one of aggression. Ukraine honors its dead as heroes, while Russia tries to hide theirs to maintain a facade of success. This lack of transparency erodes trust in the regime and fuels popular discontent. But the story doesn't end with death tolls. For every soldier killed, an estimated 3 to 4 are wounded, many of whom will never fight again. This means the total number of Russian casualties, including dead and wounded, could reach into the millions. This loss of manpower, combined with brain drain and economic sanctions, is crippling Russia for a generation. Putin's war is not just a military catastrophe, but also a demographic and economic one. The numbers tell a story of military disaster and deception, but Putin's new strategy reveals an even more desperate gamble to save his regime. Year-round mobilization transforms Russia into a permanent war economy. Society is reorganized around military production and conscription. The new mobilization legislation isn't just about recruiting more soldiers, it's about fundamentally transforming Russian society. The economy will be increasingly oriented toward weapons and military equipment production at the expense of consumer goods and services. Education will be reformed to include more military training and patriotic propaganda. Culture will be purged of elements considered unpatriotic or Western. In essence, Putin is trying to recreate the Soviet Union in its most militarized aspect, where all of society exists to serve the war machine. But this strategy of total militarization is a high-risk gamble that could easily backfire. By demanding ever greater sacrifices from the population, Putin risks fueling discontent and resistance. History shows that war economies are unsustainable in the long term and often lead to economic and social collapse. Moreover, by further isolating Russia from the rest of the world, Putin makes it more dependent on a small circle of unreliable allies like Iran and North Korea. Total militarization is not a sign of strength, but of desperation and paranoia. Compare the militarized and isolated society Putin is building with the open and dynamic societies of the West. While Russia turns inward and focuses on war, the West continues to innovate, grow economically, and strengthen its alliances. Russia's militarization is an attempt to stop time, to reverse the course of history. It's a strategy doomed to failure in an increasingly interconnected and technologically advanced world. But the militarization of Russian society has a purpose beyond the war in Ukraine. It's also a way to suppress internal dissent and consolidate Putin's power. By creating a permanent state of emergency, the regime can justify persecuting political opponents, controlling the media, and violating human rights. The war in Ukraine is the pretext for transforming Russia into a totalitarian dictatorship, where any form of opposition is crushed in the name of national security. The militarization of society is Putin's final gamble for survival, but the resolution of this conflict will reveal the truth behind his facade of power. Russia's military power reveals itself as empty propaganda. Continuous mobilization proves the special operation was always a lie. The war in Ukraine has exposed the rot at the heart of the Russian army. Endemic corruption, obsolete equipment, incompetent leadership, and low morale have contributed to one of the greatest military humiliations in modern history. The need for continuous mobilization, massive rearmament, and militarization of society is the final admission that Russia was not prepared for this war and that its ambitions far exceeded its capabilities. The image of an invincible Russian army, carefully cultivated through years of propaganda, has been shattered in the fields of Ukraine. But the exposure of Russian military weakness has implications that go far beyond Ukraine. It shakes Russia's position on the world stage, undermines its influence over its neighbors, and encourages other countries to challenge its interests. The lie of Russian military power was one of the pillars of Putin's regime. With that pillar shaken, the entire edifice risks collapse. The regime's survival now depends not on strength, but on its ability to control the narrative and suppress the truth. But in a world of instant information, this is a battle Putin is doomed to lose. Compare Russia's exposed weakness with the strength and resilience demonstrated by Ukraine. A smaller country with a smaller army has managed not only to resist the invasion, but also to inflict devastating losses on the aggressor. This is due not only to the courage and determination of the Ukrainian people, but also to Western support and the superiority of Western technology and training. The war in Ukraine is a case study in how the will to fight and allied support can overcome brute force. But the biggest lie of all may be that Putin is a brilliant strategist. His decision to invade Ukraine was a catastrophic miscalculation that united NATO, strengthened Ukrainian national identity, and isolated Russia. He underestimated Ukraine, overestimated his own army, and misunderstood the West. The war in Ukraine is not the result of a master plan, but of a series of misjudgments by an isolated and misinformed leader. The lie of Russian military power is a reflection of the larger lie of Putin's genius. The war in Ukraine has exposed the lie at the heart of Putin's regime. What remains to be seen is how long this lie can be sustained before everything collapses.